What's up, sports fans? This is the Lucas Ross Sports Channel. We continue with our 2025 college football predictions for the upcoming 2025 college football season. Up next is the Clemson Tigers. Clemson coming off a playoff appearance last year and, of course, winning the ACC championship. Is Clemson back to where they used to be, like being that dominant team in the ACC conference and, dominating this conference? Well, before we get into the predictions for 2025, first, just some thoughts on this Clemson football team for 2025. This is a Clemson team that I'm very high on this year for 2025. I think they could probably be one of the most dangerous teams in the country this year. First off, you look at the offensive side of the football. Really, everyone is almost back. On that side of the football. Cade Klubnik is back at quarterback. This offense should be pretty explosive in year 3 under Garrett Riley. First year it wasn't really explosive, but then we saw how good that offense was, and I think Cade Klubnik, with his throwing ability at quarterback, he definitely fits well into this system under Garrett Riley. Defensively, they almost bring everybody back there as well. So this Clemson team overall has a lot of production coming back on both sides of the football, and they definitely returned the most returning production this year in 2025. And that's the reason why I think Clemson probably is a favorite in the ACC to win it, and then also definitely make a playoff appearance in 2025. But let's now get to the schedule here for Clemson, and this is the schedule for them coming up in 2025. Again, Clemson, they were 10-4 last year in 2024. So let's go game by game, and I'll give you my official prediction for this Clemson team for 2025. And it all starts with a Battle of the Tigers game on August the 30th. They will play LSU, so we got to battle the Tigers here in Death Valley on a Saturday night. Yes, Saturday night primetime game at 7:30. I saw the time for this game, and yeah, these two teams will go at it in a night game. This is going to be a huge game. I've kind of been really back and forth on this game between these two teams. LSU is going to be a really good team. They potentially could be a top 5 team and a playoff team as well. I think the winner of this game probably is going to have a pretty excellent opportunity and a pretty easy opportunity to make the playoff. On the other side, though, for the loser, I think that probably will be a tough pad for them. But, Clemson plays in the ACC, and LSU plays in one of the toughest conferences in the SEC. So that's kind of the difference here between these two teams. But they do have really good quarterbacks. I think it's really going to come down to whoever is the better quarterback in this game, and that's Cade Klubnik. I do trust Cade Klubnik here a little bit more than Garrett Nussmeier. But again, that LSU offense is going to be pretty explosive, and their defense should be pretty much a lot better compared to last year. And LSU, I think, is going to have a pretty good secondary because they have a good load of linebackers. And again, I've been really back and forth on this game. It's a tough one for me to call, but I think Clemson playing at home, they get it done. I think this is probably going to be a low-scoring defensive game. It could be a shootout nonetheless, but I'm going to go actually with a defensive battle. But I'm going to go with Clemson here just because they're playing at home, not because they're the more talented team and the experienced team, but just because they're playing at home. I think that crowd will be fired up, especially in week 1 of this game. And this potentially could be a game where College Game Day probably goes, for LSU and Clemson. So definitely going to be a big game here on August the 30th in week 1. But I got Clemson starting out 1-0, and then they take care of business against Troy on September the 6th, so that puts them at 2-0 going into conference play. They will play Georgia Tech on the road to open up conference play on September 13th. Georgia Tech was a pretty decent team last year. They're going to be once again pretty decent in my opinion, and then also playing on the road. It's not a tough place to play, but we've seen Georgia Tech pull off some big upsets against really talented teams. But I think Clemson definitely is the better team here. I think it's probably a close game in the first half. Georgia Tech probably will run the football in this game and keep that Clemson offense off the field for as long as possible. But I think second half, Cade Klubnik comes around, and I think Clemson beats Georgia Tech here on the road, so that puts them there at 3-0. I'm going to say they probably win that game by like a couple of touchdowns. Maybe that's the best they can do in the rest of their games coming up here on the schedule. But you look at Syracuse, they play them next at home on September 20th. I don't really think this is going to be a close game. Syracuse probably going to have some question marks at the quarterback position, and I've been talking about Syracuse's quarterback depth. That's obviously a concern, so I don't think Syracuse is going to have a quarterback that definitely cannot defeat Clemson. I know Syracuse has given Clemson some trouble in the past, but I think Clemson wins this game easily. So I'm going to say that Clemson beats Syracuse pretty easily, and I think they improved to 4-0. Going into the month of October, they get their first bye week before playing on the road at North Carolina. Carolina on October the 4th. This is actually a pretty good spot for a bye week. It's their second road game, but this is a very tough place to play. Obviously, the Tar Heels are getting a lot of hype this year for 2025 because Bill Belichick has taken over. Again, I don't want to go too far with North Carolina. I think this is going to be a pretty solid North Carolina team. I mean, their defense, though, probably is not going to be able to slow down Clemson's offense a lot, though. Maybe this game turns into a shootout, though. Clemson probably does have a hard time, figuring out how to win this game, but, maybe by the fourth quarter, North Carolina does run out of stamina, and I think Clemson, at the end of the day, they do go on the road and beat North Carolina. I think it's probably a 10-point win. Let's just put it in that range. So a 10-point win for Clemson on the road at North Carolina, so I got them improving to 5-0. Next, they play at Boston College on October the 11th, so they got back-to-back road games here with North Carolina and Boston College. Kind of tough back-to-back road games. Boston College was a pretty big surprising team last year, and sometimes Boston College can really compete with some of the top teams in the ACC, but really not Clemson. I do trust Clemson, their experienced roster a little bit more. Maybe they start off a little bit slow after that, one game against North Carolina, but then they start to pull away. So I think Clemson wins this one pretty big against Boston College, and I got them improving to 6-0. And you never know. Clemson might be looking ahead to that game against SMU. After that North Carolina win, they're a little bit beat up, and then they start to come out slow against Boston College. And then they probably start to look ahead to that SMU game, which they do play next year on October the 18th. SMU, I've already done their prediction from yesterday, and I did pick Clemson to win this game just because I don't see Clemson losing to SMU in Death Valley. I know this is a rematch. SMU will definitely have their revenge on the minds after losing the ACC championship. I think it will be a close game. I think by the fourth quarter, Clemson probably does pull away, and I think they only win this one by like 10 points. Let's just put it that way. So I think Clemson does beat SMU. Again, you can never go against Clemson when they're playing at home in a big game like this. So I got them beating SMU and improving to 7-0. Going into the month of November, they play every single game in the week of November. They play Duke next, though, on November 1st. This will be a home game here for Clemson. The Blue Devils were a very big surprise team last year. They have a transfer quarterback coming in from Tulane. I think it's going to be pretty solid. This Blue Devil team is going to have a defense that probably can keep up with Clemson's offense for a while. And I think Duke is going to be a decent team under Manny Diaz in his second year. But I think Clemson overall is the better team. And I know a couple years ago, Duke beat Clemson at their home place. But that's a different Duke team than this one compared to a couple years ago. And I think Clemson does defeat Duke here in a pretty close game. I'm going to say they win by a 10-point win again, just like the SMU and then also North Carolina games. But I got Clemson improving to 8-0. Next, they play Florida State at home on November 8th. So look at that stretch there from October 18th to November 8th. They actually have 3 home games in a row, and that's really, that's really good there for Clemson. Then they play Florida State here. Florida State, the Seminoles, I think they'll be a little bit better this year, but I just don't know if they're like a playoff team and an ACC contender. They definitely are a dark horse team, but I just don't think they can beat Clemson here. I know a couple years ago, Florida State beat Clemson in Death Valley. Last year's game was not really close between these two teams, so I'm going to say that Clemson does beat Florida State here fairly easily. I'm going to say by a couple of touchdowns, definitely more than the Duke, SMU, and then also North Carolina games, and I got Clemson improving to 9-0. And then they play on a Friday night here against Louisville on November 14th. Of course, last year, Louisville beat Clemson in Death Valley on the road. That was absolutely shocking that the Cardinals defeated Clemson, but Clemson was still able to make it to the ACC championship even with that loss, and then also to the playoff. Louisville is going to have a roster that definitely will be competitive against this Clemson team, and then also we've seen these upsets here on these weeknight games on Thursday and Friday, but again, I think this will be a close game. Louisville definitely will make this a four-quarter type game, but I think Clemson, their experience, will get it done here, and I do trust Cade Klubnik a lot more than Miller Moss, so I'm going to go with Clemson here to knock off Louisville on the road, and they get revenge on them from last year, and I got Clemson improving to 11-0, going into the final game of the season on the road at South Carolina on November 29th. So Boy, this is a very tough game to call. South Carolina is going to be a pretty good team this year. They could be a top 15 team. Lenore Sellers is back at quarterback, and he gave all kinds of problems to Clemson last year by running the football, and this series has been really close. It seemed like the away team always wins this series, back and forth every year. We saw South Carolina beat Clemson on the road in Death Valley last year. Could Clemson probably return the favor and beat South Carolina on the road? Well, I don't know. It's a very tough game to call, and I think Lenore Sellers running the football, that's going to give Clemson's defense a little bit of trouble, and it's definitely one of these upset alert type games. South Carolina probably comes in fired up because Clemson they could be the number one team by this time, and that probably could cost them, not in the ACC, because this is a non-conference game, so it doesn't really, affect Clemson's chances of making the ACC championship, and it also doesn't really affect them from making the playoff, but this is a tough one to call, and I think they probably do split between LSU and South Carolina. They beat LSU at home, in my opinion, but then they lose to South Carolina here on the road. So I'm actually going to go with the upset here. Even though it's a rivalry game, it could be an upset alert type game because Clemson could be in the top 5, and maybe potentially South Carolina could be in the top 15. So yeah, I got Gamecocks winning this one just because we're playing at home, and it's obviously a rivalry game. It can really go either way. But I got Clemson dropping their first game of the season, and again, like I said, they probably split between LSU and South Carolina. Maybe that's the opposite, though. Maybe they lose to LSU at the beginning of the year, and then they probably, beat South Carolina. You never know. But I got Clemson finishing 11-1 for 2025. I got them going undefeated in conference play. I don't really know if anybody in the ACC can beat Clemson. You got teams like Louisville. You got, North Carolina. Those two teams might have a pretty good shot to beat this Clemson team. Maybe same thing with SMU and Duke. I don't think SMU and Duke, though, are two programs that are going to really beat Clemson and Death Valley, though. Again, I know Louisville did that last year, but this is definitely a Louisville team that has a roster that can compete. But yeah, I got to go with Clemson here at 11-1. This team can probably go 12-0. It wouldn't be really a big shock if they did go 12-0, but maybe they go 10-2. But if they go 9-3, that's kind of a disappointment because this is a Clemson team that has the most returning production coming back in all of college football this year for 2025. So let me guys know what you think about my prediction for Clemson, and also give me your prediction for 2025 for the Clemson Tigers down in the comments below. Thanks for watching this video, and stay tuned for more sports content videos on my Lucas Ross Sports YouTube channel.